I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. The first crack in my marriage appeared on a mundane Thursday. It was early morning, and my wife Claire had just left for one of her business trips. I was in the middle of my usual routine, juggling our 2 kids, breakfast, and the hum of morning cartoons in the background, when I remembered she'd left something in the glove box of her car, something I needed for the day. I stepped outside, juggling the car keys in my hand, and clicked open the door. Inside the glove compartment, under a stack of fast food napkins, I found a small, elegant bag from a high-end jewelry store. Confused, I examined it, figuring it was a gift she'd bought for an upcoming anniversary or maybe a surprise for the kids. But it didn't make sense. Our anniversary was months away, and she hadn't hinted at any surprises. I wasn't suspicious then. I was curious, maybe a little hopeful. When I saw the receipt, dated just 2 weeks back and listed to her credit card, I felt a twinge of something. The item was a platinum bracelet, something far more extravagant than her usual choices. She'd recently been on one of her trips around that time, a routine I never questioned. Claire traveled often for work, each trip lasting a few days, sometimes a week. This was a rhythm we'd settled into, me with the kids and the house, her with her deadlines and her networking dinners. As I tucked the jewelry bag back into place, I felt a faint unease, but I quickly dismissed it. Maybe she'd splurged for herself, or maybe she was planning an early surprise for me. I shrugged it off, got the documents I needed, and left for work. That night, as we video called before the kids went to bed, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling, like a weight pressing on my chest. Claire's face filled the screen, radiant as ever, her hair up in a loose bun, her smile familiar and warm. We talked about the kids' antics, laughed about a joke our youngest had come up with, and I could feel her slipping back into the role of a loving wife. Still, something in her eyes seemed different, a flicker I couldn't place. "Everything okay?" I asked casually, testing the waters. "Of course," she replied, smiling. "Just exhausted. Meetings back to back." For a moment, I felt ridiculous. Here I was, doubting her because of a bag in the car. But something held me back from feeling fully at ease. As she talked about her trip, I caught myself studying her expression, her body language, looking for some confirmation of the quiet suspicions I didn't dare voice. The next few days passed uneventfully, but my thoughts kept circling back to that jewelry receipt. One night, after putting the kids to bed, I opened our joint bank account. There, nestled between mundane expenses, was a $2,500 charge from the same jewelry store. I scrolled further, hoping to find a similar gift transaction from a previous date that might offer me an answer, but there was nothing. She'd never been one to spend so lavishly. The following weekend, I kept my discovery to myself, pretending everything was as it should be. But I couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. Our friends came over for a casual dinner, laughing and chatting in the glow of the evening lights. At one point, Jake, an old friend of mine, sidled up to me and lowered his voice. "Hey, everything all right with Claire?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" I replied, caught off guard. Just, noticed she's been a bit more distant, you know. Saw her with that new guy from her work the other night, looked pretty cozy. But hey, maybe it's just me." His words sank like a stone in my gut. I brushed it off with a laugh, claiming that work was just demanding on her. But later, as I replayed his words, the jewelry receipt gnawed at me like a splinter lodged deep under my skin. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, I couldn't stop the uneasy thoughts spiraling through my mind. I decided then to do something I never imagined I'd have to do. I needed proof, a way to confirm whether my suspicions were the paranoid fears of a husband or a brutal reality lurking in the background. The next day, I installed a discreet tracker on her phone. It felt invasive and wrong, a betrayal of the very trust one was so desperate to preserve. But the thought of waiting, wondering, spiraling into endless what-ifs was too much to bear. The tracker app was simple, almost too easy to set up. Within minutes, I had access to her location, watching her dot on the map move through her daily routine. I told myself it was temporary, just a precaution to clear my head, but deep down, I knew I was preparing myself for a storm. A few days later, she told me she'd be home late, working overtime on a big project. I pretended to accept it without question, knowing that I could confirm her whereabouts through the tracker. Hours ticked by, and as her dot stayed downtown long past office hours, I braced myself for the reality I was uncovering. Then, it happened. I watched as her location moved to a swanky hotel on the other side of town. My pulse quickened, my hands cold and clammy as I stared at the screen, watching her dot remain fixed in that same place for over an hour. The logical side of me screamed for explanations, a work function, a meeting room. But the darker, instinctual part of me knew the truth I'd been avoiding. I barely slept that night. My mind reeled with disbelief, anger, and a hollow ache that settled deep in my chest. I lay in the dark, listening to the quiet house around me, our children breathing softly in their rooms, and felt the first wave of something I hadn't expected, grief. Grief for the marriage I'd thought was untouchable, for the version of Claire I had loved so deeply, and for the life we'd built, now teetering on the edge of betrayal. I knew I couldn't confront her, not yet. I had to be certain, to know without doubt what was happening behind the scenes. Days passed, and my mind was a battlefield, torn between denial and a simmering fury that only grew each time I glanced at her. Every moment we spent together felt like a performance, my lines carefully chosen, my actions rehearsed to avoid arousing her suspicion. Claire, on the other hand, seemed oblivious, caught up in her routines, her smiles, her stories about work. But now, each smile, each laugh felt hollow, a mockery of the life I thought we'd built together. One morning, while she was in the shower, I seized the opportunity to check her phone. My hands were shaking as I navigated through her messages, my breath shallow and quick. Nothing unusual jumped out at first, texts with friends, family, the usual work-related chatter. But then I saw a name that hadn't come up in conversation before, Evan. The messages were brief, polite, nothing suspicious on the surface. But one line caught my eye. "Last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again." My stomach twisted. It wasn't explicit, not incriminating on its own, but the weight of my suspicions made it feel like a punch to the gut. I memorized his number before locking her phone and slipping it back on the nightstand just as she stepped out of the shower. "Everything okay?" she asked, toweling her hair dry. "Yeah, just thinking about work," I replied, forcing a smile. She nodded, turning back to her reflection, oblivious. But to me, she was already a stranger. That evening, after tucking the kids in, I finally looked up Evan's number, running it through a search engine. Within minutes, I had the confirmation I dreaded. Evan was a project manager at her firm, a new hire from out of town. It all clicked into place. The late nights, the weekends away, suddenly, every excuse she'd given me felt like a calculated lie, an elaborate performance designed to keep me in the dark. I closed the laptop, struggling to control the surge of anger boiling inside me. I felt foolish, betrayed, and humiliated. The Claire I knew, the woman I'd fallen in love with, had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of lying to my face while sharing our bed. The following week, she left for another work trip. As she kissed me goodbye, her bag slung over her shoulder, I forced myself to return her kiss, my insides twisting at the intimacy. She left, looking over her shoulder with a smile that, for the first time, I didn't return. As soon as she was gone, I activated the tracker. I watched her location move through the city, stopping at her office for a few hours before shifting, just as I expected, to the same upscale hotel where she had been before. I shut the laptop, feeling cold, numb. The confirmation was there, clear and irrefutable. She was with him, the man she'd replaced me with in secret. That night, I sat alone in the quiet house, the kids asleep, my mind racing. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, to hurl accusations and watch her try to justify what she'd done. But another thought crept in, one that settled in my chest with a strange calm. I didn't want a screaming match or her empty apologies. I wanted to dismantle the illusion as methodically as she had built it. I spent the next day preparing. I called a moving company, scheduled them to come by later in the week while she was still on her trip. Then I contacted a lawyer. The conversation was brief, but I left his office with a plan in place, a way to extricate myself from this mess with as little collateral damage as possible. When Claire returned 2 days later, everything was set. She walked in, looking exhausted but cheerful, as if nothing were amiss. "Hey," she said, dropping her bags by the door. "Missed you." I bit back a bitter laugh, forcing a tight smile. "Welcome home." That evening, as we had dinner, she told me about her trip, detailing meetings, seminars, a big presentation she claimed had gone well. I nodded along, my responses automatic, as I listened to the lies she spun, feeling detached from the man sitting across from her. Each word only solidified my decision. By Thursday, everything was ready. The movers arrived in the morning, efficiently packing up the house while Claire was out at work. I kept a few essentials, the kids' things, some furniture, a few personal items. The rest was loaded into the truck. I watched, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as the house was slowly emptied, as if each item they carried out was a piece of the lie I was discarding. That afternoon, after the movers had finished, I left a single note on her dresser: "You chose him, I choose my dignity." It was a short sentence, but it held all the weight of the betrayal, the heartbreak, the months of deception she had forced me to endure. I left it there, knowing that when she found it, she'd understand exactly what it meant. I took the kids and drove to a small apartment I'd rented on the other side of town. It wasn't much, just a temporary place until we figured out the next steps, but it was ours, untouched by her lies. In the weeks that followed, life felt strangely surreal. The kids adjusted quickly to the new apartment, their laughter filling the unfamiliar walls, and for that, I was grateful. I threw myself into keeping everything normal for them, routines and school drop-offs, even though my world had been upended. I wanted to tell them the truth someday, but not yet, not while they were still adapting to this new version of life. Claire, however, was a different story. The first day after she found the note, she bombarded me with calls and texts, all of which I ignored. When she tried calling from work, I silenced my phone, her desperate voicemails going unheard. It wasn't long before she appeared at the apartment, standing outside the door, hammering on it as if the force of her knocking could somehow reverse everything she'd done. "James," she shouted, her voice strained, almost frantic. "Please, just talk to me. You can't just end things like this." I sat inside, unmoved. She could wait. I owed her nothing, not even the satisfaction of a confrontation. After a while, her knocks grew softer, then stopped altogether. I imagined her standing there, feeling the weight of her choices pressing down on her. I wanted her to sit with that weight for a while. But, as I expected, she didn't give up so easily. She came by every day that week, lingering by the door, leaving pleading notes tucked under the welcome mat, her messages a mix of desperation and denial. Each day, her words became a little more panicked, a little less rehearsed. She was unraveling, and I watched with a detached satisfaction, a strange sense of justice settling in as she faced the consequences she tried so hard to avoid. One evening, after the kids were asleep, I finally answered one of her texts. The message was simple: "We need to talk." She responded immediately, her reply popping up on the screen within seconds: "Please, James, I can explain everything." I ignored her, going to bed and sleeping soundly for the first time in months. I had no interest in her explanations or excuses. They were irrelevant now. Her choices had spoken louder than any justification she could offer. 2 days later, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce paperwork. I had taken the time to divide our assets fairly but firmly, ensuring I'd retain full custody of the kids. I knew she would fight me on it, try to convince me that we could work things out, but I was prepared for that. I had already crafted a list of evidence, the texts, the tracking data, the hotel bills, proof that I could use if needed. I didn't want to use it, but if she pushed, I would be ready. After the meeting, I decided it was time to tell her my terms. I called her, listening as the ringing filled the silence, wondering if she'd even pick up. When she finally answered, her voice was hesitant, a mix of relief and apprehension. "James? Is that you?" "It's me." A long pause followed, the weight of all our unsaid words filling the space between us. "I want to see the kids," she finally said, her tone pleading. "You can't just keep them from me. I know I messed up, but they're my children, too." "They're staying with me," I replied, my voice steady. "Until we have this sorted out legally, that's how it's going to be." "James, please. I'm begging you. I made a mistake. A terrible, stupid mistake, but I'll do anything to make it right. Just let me see them. Let me see you." I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. "There's nothing left to make right, Claire. I don't need explanations, or excuses, or apologies. I need stability for the kids, and I need my own peace of mind. You gave that up when you made your choices." She started to say something, but I cut her off. "The paperwork's on the way. If you try to fight this, I'll go public with everything I know. I don't think you want that, Claire. So don't make this harder than it has to be." There was a tremor in her voice as she responded, "You don't understand, James." I was lost, confused. "It didn't mean anything." "Maybe not to you," I replied coldly. "But it means everything to me. I won't let you drag this out. Sign the papers, take what's fair, and let's end this quietly." For a long moment, there was silence on the other end. I wondered if she was trying to find the words to change my mind or if she'd finally realized that nothing she could say would undo what she had done. "Fine," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll sign the papers. But please, James, don't keep the kids from me. They're here when you're ready to visit. Supervised, until I feel comfortable otherwise," I said firmly. "We'll discuss a schedule that works for everyone." I heard her take a deep, shuddering breath. "Thank you." Without another word, I hung up, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. The weight of her pleas, her tears, they no longer held any power over me. She was just another chapter that I was ready to close. Later that week, I received a notification from my lawyer. The papers had been signed and filed. It was official, my marriage was over. I sat with that fact, letting it sink in, feeling a strange mixture of relief and loss. The life I'd built, the future I'd envisioned, all of it was gone, reduced to paperwork and signatures. But beneath the sadness, there was a sense of freedom, a fresh start waiting for me on the other side of this painful chapter. As the days passed, I settled into my new routine. I threw myself into work, into parenting, into building a life that felt whole, even without her. Some nights, when the kids were asleep, I found myself staring out the window, wondering where she was, if she ever looked back on what she'd done with regret. But those moments became fewer as time went on. I was healing, slowly, and each day without her was a step toward reclaiming the life I deserved. For Claire, I imagine the realization came like a slow burn, dawning on her as she saw the reality of her choices, as the life we built slipped further from her grasp. And while part of me felt a twinge of satisfaction at her regret, a bigger part of me was simply grateful that I'd chosen a different path, one that led away from her betrayal and toward a future on my own terms. Months passed, and the dust of the divorce settled. The kids adjusted better than I could have hoped, and our new life became a rhythm I found comfort in, even if it was a hard-earned one. Claire had visitation rights, and while I still felt a cold distance between us during handoffs, I kept things civil for the kids' sake. The apartment became home, its small spaces filled with laughter, memories, and a peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Then, one gray autumn evening, everything changed. It was a Tuesday, and the kids had been at Claire's for her weekly dinner with them. Normally, she dropped them off by 8 p.m., but when 8:30 rolled around, there was no sign of her. I figured she'd lost track of time and resisted the urge to text, not wanting to appear controlling. But when an hour had passed, my worry became impossible to ignore. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. A pit grew in my stomach as I dialed again and again, each unanswered ring feeding my unease. I was on the verge of calling the police when my phone finally buzzed. But instead of Claire, it was a number I didn't recognize. I answered, my voice tense. "Mr. Anderson?" "Yes, this is James Anderson." "Who is this?" "This is Officer Fields from the County Police Department." "Are you the father of Emma and Luke Anderson?" My heart froze. "Yes." "Is everything all right?" "I'm afraid there's been an accident, Mr. Anderson," he said softly. "Your ex-wife's car was found on Route 26. It appears she lost control, possibly due to the rain. The children are with us here at the hospital, they're safe, but your ex-wife sustained critical injuries." I felt the world tilt, the room spinning as I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. Are my kids all right?" I managed, my voice trembling. "They're okay, Mr. Anderson. Minor scrapes and bruises. But, you should come as soon as possible." The drive to the hospital was a blur of headlights and rain, my thoughts a chaotic spiral. I had prepared myself for every emotion when it came to Claire, anger, betrayal, even indifference. But I wasn't prepared for this, for the sudden realization that, despite everything, she was still the mother of my children, a presence that had shaped my life for over a decade. And now, that presence was slipping away. When I arrived, the nurse led me down a hallway lined with harsh fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of medical equipment. I spotted Emma and Luke in the waiting room, both of them looking small and frightened. I rushed to them, holding them tight, whispering that everything was okay, even though I didn't believe it myself. The doctor approached, his expression somber. "Mr. Anderson," he began gently, "Claire's injuries are severe. She suffered significant trauma to her head and internal bleeding. She's in surgery now, but I want to prepare you. Her chances aren't good." I swallowed hard, nodding even as my mind resisted his words. It didn't feel real. Just hours ago, I'd been irritated at her for being late. Now, she was fighting for her life. The kids stayed with a family friend who lived nearby, while I remained at the hospital, sitting alone in the sterile, empty room. Hours slipped by, the ticking clock on the wall marking each minute that separated me from the life I once knew. Eventually, the doctor returned, his face confirming what I already feared. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Anderson. She didn't make it." The words hung in the air, surreal and final. I nodded, unable to speak, my throat thick with unspoken grief. Despite everything, despite the anger and betrayal, a wave of sorrow crashed over me, dragging me into its depths. Memories of our early years together filled my mind, our first apartment, our wedding day, the birth of our children. I had wanted so badly to forget those moments, to erase her from my life. But now, faced with the brutal finality of it all, those memories were all that remained. Afterwards, I arranged a quiet service. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of friends, family, and colleagues. I kept my distance, letting the kids sit with her side of the family while I stood in the back, my mind swirling with questions that would never have answers. As the service ended, I watched the kids place flowers on her grave, their small hands trembling, their faces etched with a grief I couldn't shield them from. My heart ached for them, for the loss they'd have to carry with them, and for the hole that would remain in their lives, a hole I could never fill, no matter how hard I tried. The weeks that followed were a haze. I went through the motions, making lunches, helping with homework, holding my children through their tears. But the reality of it lingered, an ache that settled deep in my chest, refusing to leave. I found myself haunted by her memory, not just the betrayal, but the good moments too, the laughter we once shared, the dreams we'd built and lost. It was as if her absence had peeled back layers of resentment, leaving only a quiet, bittersweet sadness in its place. One night, I was sorting through old photo albums, looking for pictures to put in the kids' rooms. I found a picture of Claire and me on our wedding day, her smile wide and her eyes bright with a happiness I hadn't seen in years. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. It was in that moment I realized the hardest truth of all, that I had loved her, deeply and completely, despite everything. And in some way, a part of me always would. The kids and I moved forward, slowly, carrying her memory with us, even if it was a memory stained by heartbreak. In the end, life went on, but her absence lingered, a silent reminder of the love and loss that had shaped us all. And while the pain eventually dulled, I knew that a piece of me would always be bound to her, a chapter of my life that, though painful, I would never truly leave behind.